Over
Sounds
to you,
good.
Shanleigh. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And thank you so much, Dr. Thompson, for being here. I cannot wait to hear about your new book, which I'm halfway through, and it's really awesome. And so I'll just briefly introduce you. So to everyone on the call, Dr. Heather Ann Thompson is a historian and the Pulitzer Prize and Bancroft Prize winning author of Blood in the Water, the Attica Prison Uprising of 1971 and its Legacy. Thompson is also the author of Who's Detroit? Politics, Labor, and Race in a Modern American City. She writes regularly on the criminal justice system for myriad publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time, The Atlantic, and the New Yorker. Thompson policy work includes serving on a National Academy of Sciences Blue Ribbon panel that studied the causes and consequences of mass incarceration in the US, and she also co-runs the Carceral State Research Project at the University of Michigan. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Thompson to begin her talk.
Hi there. Thank you so much for having me, everybody. I have to say, a little bit at a disadvantage because you all can see me and you know who I am, and unfortunately, I've not had the opportunity to meet all of you. But I know that you're in this really incredible program that is allowing you to, think about your research in new ways, and it's a really interdisciplinary approach. And so I'm particularly happy to be in this group because I thought what I would share with you today is just, first of all, quite a bit about the new book that I wrote, but first to really set it up, really talking about research and what brought me to the research that I do. And I don't know if I don't quite know how many folks in the room are doing archival or that specific kind of research, but even if you're not, I think that I'm hoping anyway that some of this might be really helpful in terms of thinking about how to potentially approach your work in a different way. So I'm hoping, can everyone see my screen? Is that okay? We're good there.
Yes.
Okay, let me this is shades of COVID. I'm trying to navigate my my slides while doing this on Zoom. Okay, so I think you heard in my introduction a little bit about what I do. I'm a professor at the University of Michigan, and I'm a Detroiter. I grew up in the city of Detroit. I actually still live there, although currently, right now, I'm in New York because I'm on a book tour. But I became a historian in no small part because I was really interested in the present. Um, I wanted to understand a lot about how we ended up where we are today. That started for me first as a Detroiter who grew up in a city that was very, very dear to me, but it was a place that the rest of the nation so badly misunderstood and constantly dismissed. And so when I very first came to graduate school, my first project was really to do a new deep dive into the history of Detroit, which for me meant the history of Black Detroit because that was largely the community that I came from and also the family that I came from, and wanted to tell a story that frankly a lot of it wasn't in the archives. And so from the very, very beginning of my work, it's always been this project of trying to think about how do you tell a story when the people with the most power are the ones that get to leave all the archives and get to largely leave the story behind. So how do you recreate that archive so that you can tell a more thorough or full story of what happened? And then fast forward, I became a historian who was then interested not just in talking about the Black freedom struggle in cities, but my next project was trying to ask the question, how did we as a country come to lock up more people than any other country on the planet? And that project took me to a prison uprising behind bars, a civil rights uprising behind bars that became the book Blood in the Water. And the challenges of doing that book were even greater than the challenges of doing my Detroit book because, needless to say, this was a story of one of the most brutal massacres of incarcerated folks that was denied that it ever happened. The lies told at Attica went on for decades. The police shooters that had killed the Attica prisoners were protected for 50 years. So, needless to say, the state of New York was not saying, well, here's all the records. Come on in and dig around and tell the story that you want to tell. So, that book took 13 years. And the guiding principle for me was who's got the copy, maybe, who can I talk to that's never been talked to before? How do I go straight to sources that people would think are extraneous, but actually reveal a great deal? So imagine at Attica, for example, the guards were unionized. So I thought, well, did any of them file grievances that might have had information in them that would shine a light on what happened that day? Or the prisoners had been trying to tell their stories through poetry and getting through song. Can I dig into that and kind of recreate what happened? So that method, how I've approached my research has been in no small part because I'm always trying to both explain a present day that is pretty ugly, and how we got there, and therefore a pretty ugly past, meaning a past of particularly brutal racial injustice, but also a history of resistance to that, which is equally oftentimes absent from the official archives. So hopefully that gives you some context as to what brought me to my latest book. And why can't I fast forward my own slide? There we go. My latest book, which is called Fear and Fury, the Reagan 80s, the Bernie Goetz Shootings, and the Rebirth of White Rage. And I just have to tell you a little bit about how I came to this story. Frankly, I was working on a completely different book. It's a book that I'm still working on. It's about the Philadelphia police who drop a bomb on an organization called MOVE in the city of Philadelphia. It's another dramatic story of state violence like Attica it's a labor of love. It has taken me years to again try to figure out the real story and to really try to do justice to the story, particularly of the people who were victimized by the Philadelphia police, and also all of the neighbors that lost their homes. The Philly police drop a bomb on a house, kill the men, women, and children living in that house, and then literally burn to the ground two full city blocks of the city of Philadelphia. So you can imagine, again, this is a complex story of who's got the story that most people don't know because they've not been allowed to tell it, etc. But I was working on that, and then all of a sudden, a lot of stuff started happening, namely that Donald Trump could become the president in 2016, that things like Charlottesville could happen, that the uptick in police killings was becoming catastrophic, that the uptick in episodes of white vigilante racist violence was becoming catastrophic. And it wasn't that any of this is new in American history. Racial injustice and white racial violence is baked into the DNA of this country. But it really was the case that something was being newly normalized and legitimized. Consider Donald Trump saying, for example, I could go out onto Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and people would still elect me. Kyle Rittenhouse gunning down protesters and getting exonerated. The murders of George Floyd, the murder of Trayvon Martin, Sandra Bland, and so forth. So I was trying to locate what in the world happened to take what had been kind of this pretty strong, at least ideal, that the rule of law mattered, that vigilante violence was uncivilized. It's not that lynchings didn't still happen, but they were sort of outside of the bounds of what civilized people were supposed to do. How did we go from that to just an unleashing of and normalizing and legal legitimization of white rage? And it turned out that there was a story that I figured I could tether it to, and that was a story that happened back in the 1980s. I remembered the story, and it happened in New York City. New York City in the 80s, I thought was going to be the way to help us much better understand this slide. What in the world is going on when, again, people feel that they can take their racist and racialized rage out in any way they feel they want to and have no real legal consequence. So the 80s that I was going to go back to was an 80s I remember. It was a really grim time in a lot of ways. It was when I was in high school. I can remember it really well. Cities were suffering. There was, meanwhile, a terrible AIDS crisis developing. There was a crack epidemic developing. There was a powder cocaine addiction crisis developing. There was a complete evaporation of public sector jobs. There was a severe crisis on the ground. And it was in this moment that an event happens that I knew I needed to revisit, and that was a white vigilante shooting of four Black teenage boys on a New York City subway. Because I thought that that was a moment that if we could just slow the frame down a minute and look at it more carefully, we might better understand what then would happen over the next 50 years. And I'll come back to that. So it turns out that the story that I really wanted to tell, though, was the story of the four boys who are going to end up on that train that day, who are going to be the victims of that shooting. And you can see them here. On the left is a young person named Barry Allen. He was friends with Troy Canty, who is the third from the left, and they were friends with James Ramseur, the farthest on the right, and they were all friends with a young kid named Daryl Caby, the one with the glasses. And these are boys who grew up in the South Bronx, which was, again, one of the neighborhoods, one of the areas of the city most hard hit by the economics of the 80s. They were hard hit by police killings in this period. They were hard hit by the devastation of the lack of jobs, the actual drying up of resources that had been made available in public housing where they lived, that had been made available when white folks used to live there. Those resources were now all dried up. And the story I tell, I start with their story and I point out that, of course, despite all of that, the South Bronx is a wellspring of creativity and resistance. For those of you maybe here today from New York, you know that the South Bronx is the home of DJ Kool Herc and Grandmaster Flash and beatboxing and breakdancing. And there's so much, story of empowerment in this place. But meanwhile, it was also a story of real devastation. These were four kids who had dropped out of school because the school system was so devastated. They couldn't find stable employment. They didn't want to become involved in the drug trade because it was very dangerous, but they were also very aware that they had very few prospects. And I'll just leave them there for the moment. Meanwhile, over in let me just quickly say a prelude to all, well, I'm going to come back to that slide. Meanwhile, over in New York City, oops, I'm sorry, my slides are a little messed up right now. Why can't I get to this part of this? Right, okay. Something just moved in my slides. There we go. Meanwhile, over in another borough, Manhattan in New York City, was another guy who was also experiencing the devastation of the 1980s, and his name was Bernie Goetz. He was a white guy, a loner. He lived in Greenwich Village that was not as badly hit as the South Bronx, but it was pretty grim. This was the epicenter of the AIDS crisis. It was the center in Union Square Park of a real explosion in homelessness in the 80s. Things were really grim for the place he lived as well. But notably, he did not understand this as a crisis of economics, as a crisis that was being created, because it turns out it was. And he understood this crisis surrounding him as one of dependency, criminality, and the fault of people like Troy Canty and James Ramsor and Daryl Cabey and Barry Allen. So just hold that thought for a minute. Why would that be? Well, I'm going to go back to the slides where I was supposed to be a minute ago, and I will tell you that this story actually begins in the 70s. The 70s, the end of the 1970s, there had been a really severe economic crisis that basically took over the globe, in no small part because there was colonial uprisings against, corporations owning a lot of other smaller countries, freedom struggles around the globe. Capitalists are very insecure about what's happening to their ability to extract profits from around the globe. There's an oil crisis. All of this is triggering to say that at the end of the crisis, end of the 70s, there's a major economic crisis. So part of what's going on in the South Bronx and part of what's going on in Greenwich Village, and really in every city, including Detroit, where I was, had to do with this global fiscal crisis of the 70s. But here's the thing. That crisis would have repaired. It would have gotten better because it did everywhere else that it happened. But it's not going to get better here because waiting in the wings are the Reagan Republicans. The Reagan Republicans were a group of Republicans that were largely led by very, very wealthy interests who had long wanted to get rid of liberal governance in America. They had wanted to get rid of the social safety net that had given us FHA loans and had given us public schools and public housing. Because why? Because white people had gotten what they needed out of it, and now people were done with it. And rich people never wanted to pay for the social welfare net because it meant that they had to pay taxes. And they had to be regulated, right? You couldn't just run a factory and have on the job accidents because you had unions, what a bummer. You had to pay taxes into this whole system. And so there'd always been pushback against this, but the Reagan Republicans see this as a moment of opportunity. There's a global crisis economically, so they can start beating this drum that tells ordinary, particularly white working class people, look at this, the garbage is piling up, schools are in trouble, everything's in trouble. And you know why? Because it's liberal welfare state government that's creating this nightmare. And because they're really targeting white people, white working class voters who had supported the New Deal and FDR and, the social safety net, they start to really play to their racial resentments. It's not just that government is bad. Also, the problem here is that some people just don't work as hard as you do. Some people are always going to be dependent on welfare. So why should we keep putting money into welfare? Why should we keep funding things like public schools? These kids don't want to learn anyway, blah, blah, blah. They start to come up with these tropes like the welfare queen. They start to talk about drug addiction as a moral issue, right? If you just had, a better moral compass, you wouldn't be dying of AIDS and you wouldn't be a drug addict, et cetera, et cetera. But what they're really interested in is none of that. The Reagan Republicans are really interested in fundamentally altering the economic structure of this country. And what they're going to unleash is a long Reagan revolution that we are still living with today, which is where you slowly but surely take resources out of the public sector, encourage everybody that they have to go to the private sector to get anything that's valuable and that they need, and meanwhile, cut taxes for rich people, give very few resources to everybody else, and make profits that have never been seen since the 19th century. In other words, go back to the Gilded Age of the 19th century. But the way to do it, you're going to need to get buy-in from working class people who've always needed those resources. So how do you do that? You tell them again that don't pay attention to all this economic changes we're making. Pay attention to that quote unquote welfare queen. Pay attention to people still on welfare. Pay attention somewhere else. And to do that, they very heavily relied on a burgeoning media ecosystem, conservative media ecosystem run by none other than Rupert Murdoch, who is going to one day make Fox News. And this is really important because this means that the newspapers are going to be the place that everyone, this is before cable, before TikTok, before Instagram, before all that stuff. People read the newspapers and they look at nightly news. And it's going to be really important that the messaging hitting people day in and day out is there's a crime crisis, there's an economic crisis, but not to interpret it like, well, that's because we've just taken all the money out of social services, which is what Reaganomics did. It's not because there's no more funding anymore for parks or recs or libraries or job programs for teenagers. It's because of those lazy, welfare dependent Black and brown folks in cities like New York, in boroughs like the Bronx. It's very, very effective. And so you combine that media messaging with Reaganomics, and you get this economic crisis that the four boys that I focus on in the South Bronx are experiencing acutely, and Bernie Goetz is also experiencing, but he understands it as a problem of dependency and a problem with Black people. How do we know that? Because he's going to his community meetings and saying, we got to clean up 14th Street and we got to get rid of the N's and the S's. He's very clear about who he sees the origin of the problem. But meanwhile, back in the South Bronx, these teenagers are just saying, I just want a job. I just want to get some money. And so on a fateful day, all of this is going to come to a head. 3 days before Christmas, both uh, those boys and Bernie Goetz are going to end up on the same train that's hurtling downtown bound, the 2 train. The 4 boys are on there because they are planning on going to a video arcade where they're going to jimmy open some coin receptacles just to get a few quarters because that's what young kids did. And maybe they'd also panhandle a little bit, hey, you got some change, you got $5, you got this. That's their plan for the day. Bernie Goetz is on that train, by the way, with a lot of other passengers who are, they're Christmas shopping. Some are seeing their family members. Some are going to work. They're all on this one train car. Bernie Goetz gets on there because he's had a frustrated morning. He's, he's easily irritated and he just has to he works for himself. He just has to get out of the apartment. But he sits right across from these teenagers who are goofing around. They're, joking around. They're talking to passengers. Hey, what's up? You got a light? Da 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 da. And he chooses to sit right across from them, which they really notice because, frankly, nobody wants to ever sit by teenagers on a train. It's always a little unsettling. But they notice he does, and he's kind of staring at them. And so Troy Canty gets a little bold and he says, Hey, what's up, man? Bernie gets returns the greeting, and because he's kind of encouraged by this, he's like, "Hey, man, you got $5?" Again, nothing weird or out of the ordinary about that. Panhandling was everywhere in New York in this time period, and they think Troy thinks he's going to get up and get him. The guy stands up, he slowly turns, he reaches into the waistband of his jacket, and suddenly he spins around. He assumes a combat position. He shoots Troy Canty front on in the chest. His friend Barry Allen, who's behind him, hasn't even spoken to Bernie Goetz, is horrified, turns to run. Bernie Goetz shoots him in the back. Then he shoots James Ramseur, who's even farther down through the arm that goes through his lungs. And then he shoots Daryl Caby, who's the farthest down at the end of the car, and he misses him. And then, to the shock and horror of some of the passengers, Bernie Goetz walks over to Daryl Caby. And these are tiny kids, by the way. They're like 5'6". They're 18, but they're very small. They're not posing a threat to anyone else. He walks over to them, walks over to him, and he says, "You look okay. Here's another." Whereupon he puts the gun in his side and he pulls the trigger and he severs his spinal cord, thus paralyzing him forever. This story, I can just tell you, was a monumentally important event in 1984. It made world news at the time. But what was astonishing about this story was that Bernie Goetz, who, by the way, people don't even know who he is, he escapes into the subway. There's a manhunt for him. They have no idea who he is. They only had the sketch of him that you see in this picture. But he's being celebrated as a hero. Everyone's like, oh, he's the Death Wish vigilante. He's like Clint Eastwood. He's like Charles Bronson. He's got the guts to do what no other white person has the guts to do, which is to gun down these thugs and these teenagers. And kind of stunningly, the four boys that he shot, who have now been taken to these local hospitals, have been deemed not just irrelevant to the story, they are the active villains in this story. Here in the slide, you can see some of these kind of chilling Christmas cards and letters that were sent to the boys and to Daryl Caby in particular, just vile, racist, violent cards. Like the front of it would be like season's greetings, and then you'd open it up and this, poison would spill out. And they're made to be victims in no small part because while they are in the ICUs, while they're in surgery, and while this guy is on the run and no one's even found out why he did what he did, two Bronx judges and the police start poking around because surely, right? Surely these guys must have done something to deserve what they got. So they discovered that these teenagers had amassed among them about 13 misdemeanor citations, which again, you just have to trust and believe this. This is no big deal because what does that mean? It means that if you jump the subway's turnstile, you're going to get a misdemeanor citations, which is basically a ticket. And these kids had racked up a ton of those. If you're hanging around like the community center, but it's after hours, you're just hanging around outside because you got no place else to go. That's trespassing. It's a misdemeanor citation. If you are jimmying open the coin receptacles of a video arcade or a laundromat, you're going to get a misdemeanor citation because you're getting so little money out of there, it doesn't even rise to the level of robbery. So what's supposed to happen is you're supposed to go to court, you're supposed to go and you're going to get to court and you're going to have to pay $250 or whatever the fine is. So needless to say, these kids have no money. They're not going to go to court on these things. But what happens is they find these misdemeanor citations, and these judges decide to issue a blizzard of warrants for the arrest of these teenagers. They call them animals, dangerous criminals, and the front page of Rupert Murdoch's New York Post, the front page of eventually even, the New York Times and mainstream media has headlines, criminal teens with multiple warrants, got what they deserved, this kind of rhetoric. So this is a really important moment in media history, in race history, in the history of gun violence, which I'll make clear in a moment, where essentially the narrative is being completely distorted and twisted, but it's being deliberately twisted. Rupert Murdoch's papers say that these boys have sharpened screwdrivers on them. They do not. Two of them had screwdrivers in their pockets, zipped up. Nobody had ever seen them. Nobody claimed that they had ever wielded them. And why did they have them? They had them to get into those coin receptacles. But that's not what people were being told. And if you immerse yourself in this burgeoning conservative media ecosystem, you realize how important this case was. Pretty soon, the New York Post was putting out 8 editions a day on the subway, selling it to people to get them to buy into this idea that Bernie Goetz is the hero, Black kids like Daryl Caby deserve what they got, and that what's the real problem here? Liberals, big government, social spending, public sector, everything. And what you got to do is you got to trust wealthy people, businessmen to run your country because they're going to do it more efficiently and they're not going to put up with crime and they're going to crack down on crime. This should all sound very familiar, right? So the whole book tells you this story. I'm trying to get through this a little bit so that we have some time for questions. Essentially, there's a manhunt. You can see in the image on the left of your screen. There's a sketch. He's gone for 9 days. He eventually will turn himself in. The photograph next to that. In a remarkable, remarkable moment where he's in New Hampshire, he turns himself in. And he issues a 2-hour taped video confession where he not only admits to everything, he says there was no robbery. This wasn't about a robbery. He didn't like the gleam in that kid's eyes. He didn't like, New York is a cesspit. New York needs to be cleaned up. Yes, he targeted Daryl KB. He said, if I would have had more bullets, I would have killed them all. He was contemplating gouging their eyes out. I mean, he doesn't hold back in this videotape, right? So it's open shut, or it should have been, right? Because our ears and our eyes tell us what's going on. But it's going to take 2 grand juries to even get this guy to trial. And who's on the scene? Who's in the thick of all this making it happen? Well, there's a lot of names that you should recognize. People like Al Sharpton are trying like hell to get justice for the boys. But meanwhile, you got people like Rudy Giuliani on the scene refusing to file a civil rights case on their behalf, and he was the US District Attorney. You got guys like Donald Trump on the scene. You got people who are watching very, very carefully as to how this whole case is going to go forward. And the guy at the top is Barry Slotnick. Bernie gets his lawyer, who is defended John Gotti. He's slick. He's really good at this. And what's the upshot of this? The upshot of it is an extraordinary trial, which I hope you'll read about. I mean, it's just hair curling. You won't believe what you're reading. You can't believe this trial goes down the way that it does. You can't believe that Goetz gets away with what he does. But the upshot of it is he is like here's an example. They they have a whole reenactment of the crime, first of all, in front of the jury in the courtroom where they reenact something that never even happened. They brought in 4 big, very dark skinned, very angry looking black men to play the boys, who then surround a white guy to play Bernie Goetz, and they threaten him and they carry out this whole, it never happened. It never happened that way. But this is what the jury sees. Then they take the jury, this is a jury here, on a replica of a New York City subway to have them kind of experience what Bernie Goetz would have experienced just sitting on that train and feeling vulnerable, etc. I mean, just extraordinary things. The upshot of this is he's not just acquitted, he is celebrated. No attempted murder, no assault. Mind you, again, Daryl KB at this point is in a coma after being paralyzed. He will be permanently brain damaged. And these other 4 teenagers are permanently scarred, damaged, traumatized as well. But Bernie Goetz, is a hero. He is the precursor to the Kyle Rittenhouse, to the George Zimmerman. But even more importantly than he is a hero, his trial is a precedent setter. It is a precedent setter because it sends a message to white working class Americans that you can do whatever you want. When you want to be racist and violent, the courts will protect you. Oops, I didn't mean to go away from that image because that's a very important image. I don't even know how to get back to it. There we go. This is Howard Beach. This is Bensonhurst. And I also put the picture of George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin because the through line here is clear. And why is the through line clear? Because actually the Bernie Goetz case sets a legal precedent. The National Rifle Association not only supports Bernie Goetz, gives him money for his trial, but they actually take the victory that Bernie Goetz gets in this trial and they decide it is the green light for them to push their money, to funnel tons of money that will very successfully one day get them stand your ground laws in 38 US states. It will impact 2 very important Supreme Court decisions that make it possible for you to carry a gun and defend yourself with a very low bar of proof of why you felt threatened. And most importantly, it will start to change gun culture in this country. Gun culture before was, it was large gun ownership, high in the South, high in the West, but largely in the realm of hunting and sportsmanship. But the NRA takes this case to basically sell guns as your God-given American right to self-defense. Not everyone's God-given right to self-defense, right? Because black people aren't supposed to be armed, brown people aren't supposed to be armed, but white people's God-given right to the Second Amendment. So this is a very, very important case. And it was also a very important case because people like Rudy Giuliani are watching what happens. Donald Trump is watching what happens, and they understand that they now have an electorate that is willing to do just about anything to support the status quo. What is the status quo? Privileging whiteness, privileging that racial violence. But of course, you know, ignoring the fact that meanwhile, when Rudy Giuliani becomes the mayor of New York, that he's stripping social services even more, that he's putting even more money in the hands of the really wealthy people. And essentially, this is a moment in time when white working class people are being sold this Faustian bargain. They're being told you can do what you want, you have as much rage and resentment as you want, but just don't pay attention to the shiny object over here, which is meanwhile, rich people are getting richer and richer and richer, and you're actually getting poorer and poorer, and you're not going to be able to send your kid to college either. You're not going to be able to pay your rent either. But don't mind that. Don't pay attention to that. Focus on your black or brown neighbor who's suffering even worse than you are, because really this is their fault. This media manipulation is so powerfully important. When Giuliani gets elected, Rupert Murdoch also gets Fox News. And history is changed in these two moments because there's somebody else on the scene who fully understands the importance of this, and that is Donald Trump. Donald Trump understands that the New York Post, Murdoch's paper, is the place where not only can you sell racial rage, you can also sell this idea that greed is good, that businessmen should be trusted over government officials, that things are more efficient if a businessman does it than if a government official does it. And he understands that the white working class voters that have been cultivated will be his voters. And so when Fox starts, Donald Trump, who has always really flirted with politics, he was a Republican, he was a Democrat, he was an independent. He understands that Fox News is going to be his ticket forward. And in 2016, when Fox has already become the biggest news outlet in America in terms of viewership, he's on there like 200 times. And he understands how important it is to constantly use misinformation and rage and race baiting to keep his electorate in his camp. And he does it absolutely masterfully. Now, I'm just finishing up here so we can chat. What is the upshot of all of this? It's the slow 50-year long Reagan revolution that creates what I'm calling the rebirth of the Jim Crow Gilded Age. If you look at this graph on the left, you will be stunned if you actually pay attention to it. This is the income of the top 1% compared to the share of income of pretty much the bottom 1% or the bottom 50%, right? And notice by the time we have had the Reagan 80s and get into the 90s, these cross fundamentally to create some of the worst income inequality, with rich people making more money than they ever had in American history. This is really important. Meanwhile, as income inequality is increasing, so are hate crimes and white racist rage. And that shouldn't surprise us because these are necessary flip sides of the same coin. You cannot strip all public services from everybody without having diversionary tactics, because eventually people wake up and realize they can't eat either. They can't afford life either. And so this was a tactic used in the 19th century, and it is a tactic that the Reagan Republicans will bring back really craftfully, skillfully, beginning in the 80s. And Donald Trump will just kind of lift the veil on it. He won't even pretend to use obfuscation. He just completely wallows in misinformation, because by the present day, Fox News has understood that it's worth paying out 250, 550, eventually $740 million in fines for spouting lies on their network, that amount of money is worth it if what you can do is put a class of people in the president's suite that essentially will roll back all business regulation, will change the tax structure so that basically rich people never pay any taxes anymore, and that somehow on the ground everybody else is destabilized, unsettled, divided, and that racism and racial rage is the defining characteristic of our country as it was again in the 19th century. Believe it or not, this is not a story of desperation and despair. It is also a story of resistance, as you will see in my book. This is a story, there's always serious pushback to this. The boys pushed back, the Black community pushed back really, really hard against this. There's one exception, and that's Roy Innis here on the bottom right, who welcomed Bernie Goetz. And I mention him because I want to note that this is a class issue that oftentimes did cross racial lines. There were middle-class Black folks like Roy Innis who basically also had drunk the Kool-Aid. There's just this hopeless, irredeemable Black underclass, and we shouldn't help them anymore either. But he's an exception. There is incredible support for seeing justice for these boys. And one of the most important voices for seeing justice was Daryl Caby's mother. She is the heroine of this whole book, in my opinion. She is the one that will never stop fighting for her son to get some measure of justice. The end of the book is the civil trial against Bernie Goetz, where she will win a $43 million judgment against Bernie Goetz. He won't pay a dime because this is the rich man's America, but it is nevertheless, a very important story that this is not an American history that goes unchecked, and therefore in it is the seeds potentially of the future. And this is my last point. This moment we are in was crafted with deliberate care, very, very carefully, and over a very long period of time. But it was always unstable. And the way we know that is that there have been these moments in time when it's just not worked the way that they had hoped it would. And one of the key moments is around 2008, 2009, when we see the explosion of the Occupy Wall Street movement, we see the explosion of the Black Lives Matter movement, and we see the landslide election of Barack Obama, which, for whatever criticism you might have of any of these things, you have to understand that this was a stunning, stunning upset in American history, given where we had been. For example, Bill Clinton completely ending welfare as we know it, and locking up more Americans than even Reagan had dared to try to lock up. So this was a stunning upset. And to understand how unstable this all was, this is the moment when Donald Trump decides not just that he's going to run again, but that he's going to double down on white racism to do it. He's going to take those same white working class voters that were in Occupy, and he's going to tell them, no, 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 you don't want these commie socialists that want to rein in Wall Street. Forget Wall Street. You want to start dealing with the immigrants. You want to start dealing with poor Black folks living in the ghetto who can't get out of poverty by just taking the matters into your own hands. So he starts using misinformation to cleave away important coalitions that were being built, particularly by the time we get to George Floyd's summer, by racial activism against police violence, against state violence. It took a lot of work, though, to then bamboozle people with misinformation to turn this all around again. So what is the bottom line? The bottom line is it's unstable. And if you look at New York today, and this is the photograph on the bottom right, the election of Mamdani is a very significant election because this is one of the most economically unequal and racially unequal cities in the country, and yet he wins by a landslide as a democratic socialist because people were tired of, again, being sold rage as a substitute for social services, rage and racism as a substitute for real community building. And, the jury is out. We will see what happens. But if we go to the end of this story, which is the story of Daryl Cabey and his mother, we are reminded what the costs of this racial rage are, how deliberately curated and created and manifested it was, and not for just no purpose, but for the purpose of making us one of the most economically unequal countries with some of the fewest social resources of any other Western democracy. And maybe if we understand how we got there, how we became a gun-toting place with so much gun violence, a place with so much white racist violence, if we understand how that happens and how people were uh, moved and manipulated to get us there, then at least it is my hope as a historian that we can make a different history. So that's it. Thank you. And I'm happy to talk about the book. I'm happy to talk about the research into the book, whatever people might want to talk about.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That was an incredible presentation. And I feel like when I read your work and hear you speak, there's so much nuance and so many human stories, and yet we zoom out so well to see the bigger narrative. So thank you so much for that. So now we can welcome any questions that anyone has. You can put them in the chat, raise your hand, or unmute yourself. I'll give it a moment. Okay, Caitlin, go for it.
Hi, Dr. Thompson. Thank you so
Hey.
much for your presentation. I'm so excited to read this book. I was rereading Blood in the Water this
Oh my
morning.
goodness.
Yeah,
Look at your tabs. I'm
it was
impressed.
I got introduced to this book in my first year in graduate school, and it's your writing style, your care with the story is just really, really fantastic and something that I admire so much. And I'm excited to read those same types of that same type of writing style in your new book too.
Thank you.
One question that I had is as you're presenting, you're talking about how the present really inspires you to look to the past. And I'm curious about how you sort of balance the time it takes to do this work, years of research, of finding people, of doing this archival research, especially when this archival research is often hidden from the public. How do you balance that time with the sort of urge, I guess, to speak to the moment? I guess if
Ah,
that makes sense.
that's a great question. I mean, it's not easy to navigate. Blood and Water took me 13 years because I couldn't find this. I mean, it just was such a journey to constantly be have the door shut in your face, or order FBI files and have all of them be so redacted you couldn't see anything, or trying to interview people who were too terrified to talk to you or whatever. And in Attica, I happened, as you know from reading it, upon this cache of records that changed everything because I was able to name the shooters after 50 years. But, it was I mean, I couldn't do it quickly. And of course, over the course of writing it, even the criminal justice landscape changed a lot. I mean, when I started the book, it was 2004. And, Michelle Alexander and I were both cohorts working as fellows, and she's working on the new Jim Crow. I mean, nobody had even coined the term mass incarceration yet when I started the book. By the time I finished the book in 2016, we were knee deep in a really profoundly important criminal justice reform moment where we were finally reining in things like solitary and at least talking about decarceration, right? So it's not easy to kind of constantly write about something when your landscape feels like it's changing in the present. And I guess that's one of the reasons why with this book I did it quite differently. I mean, I did this book in basically 2.5 years. I just like I mean, first of all, my kids are now out of the house and things became a little easier, but I literally just, this is what I did. And I was still teaching and everything else. But I mean, when I wasn't like, I was in this, right, 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 right. And, it was a different kind of project as a result of it. And I think you'll read it's a different kind of project than Blood in the Water. Blood in the Water is much more of a just granular narrative. And the center of Fear and Fury is a granular narrative too. But I got a lot of big point history more in this book. I'm not sure which one's more successful, but I felt the need, to your point, to just write much more quickly because it felt urgent. It felt a different kind of urgency to be really frank. So I would say, if you're interested in the present, if you're really interested in the past, what it says about the present, it's always going to be timely and it's always going to be relevant. But it is a little jarring when the present changes. Like all of a sudden, I mean, if all of a sudden, here's a quick, I'm going to stop talking, but let me just quickly say that Mamdani got elected after my book went to press. So that's a perfect example of here's the New York City I'm talking about as being one of the most illiberal, racist, in fact, the last thing I talk about is how Daniel Penny goes on a subway and puts somebody in a chokehold. And, essentially it's the Bernie Goetz episode all over again. I didn't know that Mamdani is going to win by a landslide in New York City. I mean, if I would have had that hopeful anecdote, believe me, that would have been at the end of my book. But I didn't know. So thank you for that question. Don't be shy. Anybody else? Research question, any kind of question, or tell me something about what you're working on. I'm also a really good resource of like, how do you find sources or how do you look somewhere where nobody wants you to look?
Could you speak, sorry, Shannon, if I'm jumping in, but could you speak to your archival process? Did you have to do IRB for any of this? It just feels so past pressing up against the present in a really sensitive way.
Yeah, so I think there's two layers to that answer. One of them is more of a I want to say like an ethical, moral answer, and the other is a literal regulatory answer. So as historians, we don't have to use IRB. I mean, the Oral History Association has been pretty clear. The American Historical Association is pretty clear that that really doesn't apply to us. However, when you deal with this present day of history, as I do, even if I'm not legally bound to do IRB, I am always in my work dealing with very sensitive, not sensitive, that's the wrong word. What's the word I'm looking for? Populations, not sensitive, Jesus. Vulnerable, thank you. Vulnerable populations, right? Prisoners, people in public housing that could be kicked out, vulnerable people, people suffering AIDS, like, there's a million things. And so you do always have to really think about the ethical, like how are you making sure that you are not being exploitative of people or putting people in harm's way? So that's the IRB question. The archival question is, I have to just say, like maybe when I was little, I wanted to be Nancy Drew. I don't know. Like I approach archival research like I am an imaginary detective. Yes, I go to the archives. Yes, the first stop is always, does the New York Public Library have a collection on this? You know, does does the Library of Congress have papers related to this? And that's always like first number one, go to Archive Grid database and see who's talking about this. But I so often find that that's unsatisfying. So then the next stop is FOIA everything from freedom, from the FBI and the CIA and the school board and the, the whole spate of that. So that's the legal piece of it. But honestly, for me, it's always about, I always just ask myself, who has the copy of what I want? Or who was there on the scene that has something to say to it that I haven't thought about? Or, you know, the union records, or one of the most important things that I got for this story, I couldn't imagine. I'm trying to tell the story of four kids who've been written out of the story. But I find this document, which is Daryl Caby's mother applies for compensation from the New York The New York Crime Victims Board, very important, which was a fund that Reagan even funded because he's like, victims, victims, victims of crime. We're all about victims of crime. So she's like, my son is paralyzed. He's been shot by someone carrying an illegal gun. I'm going to apply for this money. And this was like a treasure trove to me because what an unexpected source to look at. But in it was so many details about their family. And this is where I learned that his father had been killed and that they all lived together in a house in Far Rockaway, Queens, and his dad was killed trying to save his truck from a carjacking. That's how they ended up in public housing. I learned family details. I learned that their dog's name was Flacco. I learned so many details from this, but mostly what I learned was the extraordinary acrobatics that petty state actors went through to make sure that this kid was not going to get any support. And that got me thinking all about the layers of state violence, right? It's not just the police. It's not just the person wielding the gun, right? It's all these layers of bureaucratic violence done to keep things the way that they are. And so that would be an example of a source that like you wouldn't find that in an archive, but it was so important. And also, can I just say to anyone who's doing this kind of work, always find the lawyers who were involved in your story, even if they are only involved peripherally, because if this was an important case to somebody and they have saved the transcripts or the depositions or their notes or any of that, those are the most invaluable sources you could possibly get. But I also Google, like what was the temperature on December 22nd, 1984? Because that's how I understand. Well, like, why does he only have a little windbreaker on? Because it was unusually balmy that day. Or, how many subway cars were on the 2 train in 1984? Or how big? Like, I had to diagram out it. I had to like do a whiteboard, like where are they sitting on the train and who could see what and how could the bullet have gone that far? I mean, you're becoming like a ballistics expert the next thing. I mean, what do I know about a 38 Wesson? Next thing I know, I'm like knee deep in the what does it mean to have a jacketed versus an unjacketed bullet? Like, so it's really just be curious. Like, think of yourself like a detective, not like a scholar in that sense. Because when you think of like a scholar, oh, and also think about narrative. Like when you're looking at a picture of somebody, this is what Caitlin was just talking about. When you're looking at a picture of someone, we are trained to just say, and the man sat down. Well, why don't we say what he looks like, what he sounds like? What he was wearing, how tall he was, how short he was, right? Because then we start to see him and care about what's happening, whereas the man sat down. So part of it is also just about like vocalizing on paper what you have just seen with your own eyes, right? Or like I'm in knee deep in the lyrics of, whatever, Run DMC, or I'm like, I'm like, oh, let me really look at the lyrics of Fight the Power. Like what are they actually saying? Or, and so forth. So very long-winded answer, but it's what makes me love what I do for a living. And it's what I would do even if I wasn't employed by the University of Michigan, because it's the fun part of deep dive, look under the rock, who has something, who doesn't have something. That's the best part of it to me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. Do you think we have time for one more question, or is it too close to time? What do you think?
If someone has one, it's good for me, but whatever you all think.
Okay. Your last chance here. Everyone.
I'll ask one if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
Um, since you brought up narrative, I mean, it's something that I think about a lot. Is that there's
Mhm.
just times where, I mean, and this goes to a conversation about archival limits too. That
Mhm.
to like the limit exists. I mean, I think of this Sadia Hartman expose from
Mhm.
Revere Goes in the New Yorker, which is like archival limit that's a matter of power. right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
that in many ways is just it's a fiction, and
Yep.
like she kind of rejects it through narrative and through storytelling. And I'm curious if you found that, that sometimes storytelling is the only real way to be sort of faithful to the past, and how you see that line, if it's blurred or if you view it as simply
Yeah.
concrete.
Yeah, I thank you for that, Daniel. I feel like, for anyone who's interested in this subject in more depth, I mean, this whole idea of what is, critical confabulation, what is it okay to even extrapolate? What is it okay to narrate versus what are you actually seeing on the page that someone said? I mean, there's so many layers to what you're asking, and I would say that, I'm somewhere in between, which is to say that I believe that if you actually open all of your senses, right? What you smell, what you see, what you hear, and you actually try to do that as ecumenically and as broadly as possible, that storytelling can be incredibly rich and incredibly valuable. And especially if it's guided by you actually listen first. What are other people's stories, right? It's not about you are ultimately the one who's telling the story, but it's actually about you being a conduit, I would say, for the story, right? Because you can't tell everybody's stories equally and evenly because of your own positionality. Everyone has positionality. It just differs on different, differs what it looks like. So being a conduit to storytelling is incredibly valuable. It is a vital antidote to the what some people have actually called the violence of the archive, right? That the archive can be not just empty of voices, but to actively silence those voices in their absence. Um, and I agree with all of that. I would just say though that I believe strongly that one can still learn a lot from those state sources. I believe it's actually incumbent upon us to not ignore those state sources, to not ignore archives, because there is a tendency, I think people would welcome that as well. They're like, oh, basically fuck the archive. No, because in fact, you learn a great deal about power from power brokers. You learn a great deal about racism from racists. You learn a great deal about violence from violent people. And you can't dismiss power, um, but you have to wrangle it in such a way so that it doesn't blind you or doesn't tell the story for you. But it can be very valuable. I'll tell you, during working on Attica, I there was a interview that I did with one of the guards, and a lot of people would be like, why would you talk to the guards? Well, I will tell you something. I learned more about the level of violence that actually happened in that prison from that guard than I could have possibly ever learned. Uh, because I learned about how it was planned, how it was executed, how it was justified, right? And that was really important to narrating the violence of that story. Similarly, in the Move book that I'm still working on, I just had the opportunity to interview the police officer that dropped the bomb. Now think about that for a minute. Why would you want to talk to someone that created that kind of harm? Well, because I don't, I just sit back and say talk. Like, people show you who they are, but it is incredibly valuable to hear what all of that kind of what they're doing, what they think they're doing, and oftentimes they say things that they have no idea they're actually even saying, and therefore you actually can empower the narrative in ways. So I'm really kind of in between, I would say. I would say look at it all and then make sure you're actually letting the people whose stories don't get told uh, get the most light at the end of the day. But thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Thompson. This was wonderful. We're over time, so sorry about that, but we appreciate you staying to answer these questions. And this was a very valuable presentation. So thank you and best of luck.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And if I can help anyone in some other capacity, just you can find me at Michigan. Just send me an email.
Thank you.
All
Thanks,
right, y'all take
everyone.
care. Okay, bye-bye.